Hi, everybody. I'm Orange Sweetmeat from IT Services, and welcome to the Mobile App Challenge Speaker Series. Let's see. Today, we're going to have Melissa and James from the CI3 talk about all the exciting stuff they're doing. But before they start, I just want to say stuff you probably already know. Mobile App Challenge is brought to you by IT Services, the Polsky Center for Entrepreneurship, and UChicago Tech. UChicago Tech having generously contributed the $10,000 grand prize for the second year in a row, which we're really excited about. As I think people probably know, November 17th, which is this Sunday, is the deadline for entries. We're running considerably ahead of where we were last year at this time for entries, so we're looking to have a good field of entries in the contest this year. Last year we had 113 entries. We're hoping to double that, so we'll see where we get on Sunday. And then the next talk in the speaker series is mobile technology and the law of market information parity, which we're all really curious to know what that means. And we'll be here on December 6th to hear Adam talk about that. We do ask that you RSVP if you're going to come to the talks, but if you just happen to show up without having RSVP, we'll let you in. Right? Right. Okay, that's it for me. We in IT Services have been fortunate enough to be working with Melissa and on what has now become CI3 and the Game Changer project since its inception about 3 years ago, and it's been fun and really interesting, and it's great to see it take flight and come on with a life of its own. And I'm really interested to hear what Melissa and James are going to talk to us about today. Take it away.
So you want me to start? So
actually, let me show you.
Yeah, exactly. So, good afternoon. I'm Melissa Gilliam. I'm a faculty member in obstetrics and gynecology, and I'm a pediatric gynecologist, and I also head the program in family planning. So most of my work is thinking about most of my work is thinking about adolescents, and I came to this field really thinking about teen pregnancy and teen pregnancy prevention, but I use a number of frameworks, mainly ones in which we try to think about how do we get the patient involved in her own decision making and really empower the patient in the process. So I'm going to talk to you about the app that I designed in conjunction with IT Services and that we launched through the Mobile App Challenge now 2 years ago? 2 years ago. And so it's been a wonderful process. And I think what's been exciting for me is that technology is such a great way to work with adolescents. And so it's really opened our work in many ways. And so when I finish, Jim will take over, and Jim heads our game design lab, and you'll sort of see kind of this interaction between what we've done with an app, but how we're using games and even kind of a more, I think, kind of leading our work even further with games. But what I'll describe is something that fits in more of the traditional clinical setting, and I'm excited to see Shirley because she worked on this project. So this is an iPad waiting room app, but it really starts with the public health challenges of adolescents. I often go to the public health challenges because that's often what drives the work. It drives sort of the human impact, and it helps us understand the amount of money that we spend trying to deal with the twin problems of STI and pregnancies in adolescents. And so this was at least initially the question that brought me to working with adolescents and reproductive health. The first is that adolescents really have the major burden of sexually transmitted infections, really this population 15 to 24. So just at the time you're emerging into adulthood, you're exploring, you can often pick up an infection, some of which will stay with you for the rest of your life. Chicago is a great place to study it If you look at this map, what the most important thing is to understand that the darker colors have the highest rates. And so Illinois has one of the highest rates of chlamydia. I can show you the same thing for gonorrhea and syphilis, and it will all map to Illinois. And it's predominantly driven by Chicago and Chicago's south side, so we're kind of the epicenter of the problem. So it's a important place to try to solve some of these problems. And this shows you that it's predominantly driven by young women between the ages of 15 and 24, and so that's my population in the gynecology clinic. The other thing that I look at is adolescent pregnancy, and overall, the news for teen births is that they are declining, and so this kind of gives you snapshots in 3 different time periods for lots of different racial ethnic groups. But you can see that teen pregnancy rates are predominantly driven by non-Hispanic blacks and Latinos. And so again, a very critical problem. And if you looked again at a map from the Board of Health for Chicago, you'd see the places where in the neighborhoods where it's most deeply concentrated are the ones that surround our institution. So those are the questions. And what's important about thinking about it in a public health context is that when we are in a clinical setting, you're dealing with a patient right in front of you. When you start to think about it in a public health context, then you start to think about scaling. And that's something that's very hard to do other than with medications from a clinical context. We're very used to thinking, well, we use one type of intervention and we try to get it to as many people. But when we start to think of things that are more behavioral, scaling that can be really hard. And so that's why I got to this idea of how do we start to teach young women about contraception. Now, you'll see that actually people tend to use the most ineffective forms, nothing, or condoms, intermittently. So we really have to start moving them towards more effective forms of contraception. So while technology allows us to start thinking about scaling ideas, we have to be really cautious not to think that technology solves what's really a social problem. And so, and I think about that a lot, and want to tell you about this work kind of in the context of the larger work that we do at CI3 and the larger work we do at Game Changer, because part of our interest in technology and games is how they are mediators of human relationships. And so we think it's an important tension that we deal with, this tension between trying to reach lots of people, but trying to think about interventions that are meaningful and deep and likely to change behaviors. My framework for thinking about this is in a developmental approach. And so these are sort of these ideas, and the thing that kind of captures it for me is sort of thinking about those little Russian dolls where you sort of think about any individual, you're a function of your biologic self, but you're also your social self and your community and your neighborhood and your society and the politics and the country that you live in. And so unless we're kind of thinking about the more complex things, it's often hard to get interventions to stick. And so those are the types of things that we think about in our research as we move forward. Jim will tell you more about our design lab, but this is kind of the types of settings we try to create. Ones where we're bringing the young people, the community, into the process of developing the interventions. So we're not thinking of something that's completely sterile and unlikely to be adopted. And so that is how we work. It's a little, at times, messy, but hopefully our goal is to see that it's effective. So the study that I'm presenting today started out with we didn't start out with a solution, we started out with a question. How do we begin to improve intrauterine device services in a Title X clinic? If you all understand the Title X process, you may not. It's a federal, or it may not be something on your radar, because it's the federal funding to provide contraceptive and sexually transmitted infection and reproductive health services to the poor. And it's one of the largest systems that goes into rural areas, urban areas, really trying to focus on the hardest hit sectors. And so they divide the country into a series of catchment areas, and this is where these clinics are located. So it's a great way to work because it becomes a national network. A number of them are located and run by Planned Parenthood. So what happens is an institution applies for Title X funding, and then it provides access to these services. And so you would think in a place where most things are being provided free of cost, you'd have minimal barriers to uptake. But what you know in a clinical setting is that there are tons of barriers. You can think about it yourself. Think about how long you wait in a doctor's office. Think about just even making the phone call. By the time you actually get face-to-face with the provider, if you get there and they don't even have things ready, there are lots of ways in which it's not just you and your determination to come in. If you talk about an adolescent living in the neighborhoods we worked in, Roseland, Englewood, then Austin, which is more on the west side, these are the adolescents with the most complex lives. And so once they get to the clinic, the last thing you want is unnecessary barriers to care. And so that was the question: how can we limit barriers to care? We went through a fairly complicated process that we borrowed this from the nuclear industry, where they analyze, so I don't want to say that I'm not getting your contraceptive method is the same as having a nuclear accident, but the consequences for an individual are pretty severe. And so what they do, it's called the failure mode effects and criticality analysis, and we've done some adaptations. But the idea is it gives you a way to systematically study a situation and identify the problems and then rank them so that you're addressing the most critical barrier to a successful outcome. You start qualitatively, you bring all the people involved into the process and hear from them where the problems are. You hear what the system is, so you describe and map the system, and then you rank it and back it up with quantitative data. This is a process map for how IUDs are delivered at Planned Parenthood, and all the steps, and then we back it up quantitatively. So it's not good enough to say, it's the waiting room, that's the problem. We have to find a way to quantitatively measure how many people leave the waiting room, or how many people make an appointment and don't show up, how many people, and so they have impressions, but you have to back it up with data. What you do is you then go into something called risk fitting, and you say, what is the frequency in which it happens, what is the consequence of it, and that starts that process of weighting the problem. And so what we found out is that people are not learning about all methods of contraception during counseling. Maybe the counselor has her own thoughts about whether someone should get the method. And we focus particularly on the intrauterine device and the implant, because those are methods that it's a one-stop visit, and then you don't have to think about pregnancy. It's the most effective. You don't have to think about it for 5 years. So all you need is a person who agrees who's interested in getting it at that time. And so our thought is that if you're trying to prevent teen pregnancy, the last thing you want is a teen to come in and not know about this method or not get it when she wanted to get it. So the two problems we identified were right up front at the time of scheduling. They had a tremendous no-show rate, and then they also had a huge number of patients who would come and they'd say, well, you had sex the night before, so we can't give it to you. Come back in 2 weeks, and then they'd never come back. So just a lot of inefficiencies in the system. We did two things as a result. One I won't go over today, which is that we redesigned the intake process for the clinic. And through that, which is we basically went to their call center. I learned everything that they do. We learned all the types of visits. We completely reworked it to make it the most efficient so that the woman got the information she needed up front and was completely prepared at the time of the visit. And also, if she wasn't prepared, gave the clinic plenty of warning so that they could schedule a new patient. And it actually really increased the efficiency of the clinic just by retraining the people on the front lines. But the second thing we did was we designed an app because we identified that counseling at the beginning was not going that well. So I'm a researcher, so things need to be evidence-based and theory-driven. And so we chose the theory of planned behavior. And so this is a theory about how do you change behavior. And the idea is that it's not the behavior itself that people focus on so much. It is their intention, which is informed by their attitude, and then what their sort of normative beliefs are, kind of what your mother said, what your sister said, and whether you think you can actually do the behavior. And so we wanted to incorporate those ideas into the app itself. And so One thing I didn't mention is that we actually had young women who were part of the process of developing the app, and so I'll show you what that looks like as well. And so we ended up with video testimonials from young people, and we're trying to adjust those normative beliefs. So we actually had them talk about their true experience, not all the myths and things that I'd spent a lot of time researching and studying how many myths and misinformation people had. We really had, but we had young women telling one another about these methods and their experience and why they were really good methods for them. And so we took the theory and we embedded it in the app. And then we've had other kind of informational pages. We did a lot of usability testing. So this was an app that was developed in conjunction with women in the clinic. Now, the first one was a total cheat. We went to the OBGYN clinic here, just so for this very first, where we're just trying to home in on what it would look like. We really didn't want to keep traveling all the way to the south side to try and fix the further south side to try and fix it. So we went to the clinic and just tried to get the initial visual design, whether they comprehended it, navigation. And our clinic population really reflects the parts of the target population, so we felt fine with that. And we would talk about the information content. And we'd ask them to narrate their experience. We'd ask them to, we'd have kind of a standardized script, so we were always asking the same questions. And then we would video record so that we could go back and then make major changes between the visits. The next round of iterative design actually occurred in the clinic itself. And so we followed the same pattern. Any minor design decisions were made on site, so we're kind of constantly redesigning, and then majors happened between sessions. And we would kind of slowly use higher quality. So initially it was kind of a PowerPoint slide, and eventually then we'd add YouTube videos, and so slowly we built the app out. And so that's what this looked like. Eventually started moving into these kind of more developed phases of app design and continuous feedback. And we learned a lot this way. For example, there are a lot of ways of talking about contraceptive efficacy. But as you know, we have kind of an innumerate society in general. And so this idea of how do you understand risk and how do you display risk is always a hard question. And so this is what they like, this idea of show people what's the most effective up top, and so show us by effectiveness. But typically, and the World Health Organization has studied ways of showing efficacy, and they sort of say leave the numbers out. But these young women really wanted the numbers. Like, how many of us are going to get pregnant how many pregnancies are going to occur with each method? And so that's how we ended up showing it. They also picked what they wanted. They wanted to know for each method, how does it work? They wanted sort of a myth-busting section, is it true? And then what can I expect? And then they actually wanted a section on what will he expect, like what will he experience? And I hadn't seen that in an app before, but it actually was so perceptive because there's an emerging body of research which is saying one of the reasons that we're always failing is that we just never think about the male. It's always this kind of female-focused approach to contraception. So it got embedded in our app. So we then studied it. This is the flow diagram for our study. We performed a randomized controlled trial. One of our medical students did most of the clinic sitting, so hats off to Emily. And we randomized. So we screened a total of 66. We had 54 eligible. We focused on young women. And then we randomized them evenly into the intervention and control groups. And one group one group looked at the app, the other group just completed a survey, and then they went back into the clinic and we reviewed their charts. These data need to be cleaned up, so but I want to at least give you kind of a first pass. So the median age was 23. They were predominantly African American, unmarried, at least. Most of them had gone to high school. Almost everyone had sex. The median age of first sex was 16, and most of them were using condoms at the time of the visit, and all were interested. And I think this is the main finding from the app use, which is that it really changed the percent of, changed the method mix that people were interested in. So when they came in, they were predominantly interested in birth control pills, a little bit the ring, a little bit the patch, and a very few were interested in long-acting methods, and nobody was interested in the intrauterine device. And post looking at the app, there was a switch where the small 7% were interested in the intrauterine device and 25% were interested in the app, of the implant. And that works really well because after this you go into counseling. So what the point of the app was to raise awareness and to raise interest, which could then be followed up by counseling. So they said overall it was easy to use. This is a Likert scale from up to 5, and so 4.72. We saw a significant increase in knowledge. There was an interest in discussing methods, and those are the bar graphs that I showed. And then we had to, one of the things that we had to clean up is that we had a number of people who had come in specifically planning to use an IUD or an implant. And some of them, 1 or 2 people were actually coming in to get one removed and another one put in. And so we ended up throwing those out of the analysis. And this isn't statistically significant, but 22% in the intervention group ultimately chose a long-acting method compared to 16% in the control group. And so what we concluded is that this app is a really useful adjunct, and that you can actually have patient self-education in the waiting room. We've submitted this to a couple of places. We've submitted it to the National Institutes of Health and to the Hewlett Foundation for further development. What I'd like to do is make it into an app that talks both about sexually transmitted infection prevention and pregnancy prevention, and then would like to start to really incorporate males more into the intervention. And I think even though this is a waiting room app, and the reason it's a waiting room app is because we're thinking about how much connectivity is there for these young people. Eric and I were just discussing smartphones, cell phone use. In our work with adolescents in the Game Changer Lab, we're finding that plus or minus access to computers. And as you know, the Chicago Consortium for School Research just did a study to show really there's not that as much connectivity as we'd like to see for these young people. So we put the app right in the waiting room so that wasn't a barrier. But I think ideally this would be something that you would download before you come to clinic. You'd have all of your instructions and your information. And the advantage of using video is that if you have a low literacy population, you can actually just tell it to people, and they're hearing it from their peers, and you can do a mixture of peers or physicians or whoever they feel are trusted with the information, and then they would come to clinic prepared. In the NIH proposal we just submitted, we actually wanted to include men in the process so that at the end of the visit there's also information for him as well. So those are sort of so that's it, and we do this as teamwork, and I also just want to thank Cornelia and Oren and Eric for all of the help that they always give me whenever I have a question, which is often. But I think it also illustrates what I think is a really important part is trying to incorporate the communities where these interventions are going to go as often as you can, really doing a thorough assessment of the clinic or the situation so that you know. It took us probably, I think we were in the field for 2 years before we ever designed an actual intervention, so that the process of making sure that you're incorporating the community, but also know the problem you're able to solve and know whether it's going to whether it can be implemented in the place that you're trying to implement it. We're all just some really good practices that we followed, and I think it's really paid off for the work. So I will turn it over to Jim unless someone has questions.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, how often is it that the guy is actually at the clinic with that young woman?
Yeah, so Planned Parenthood has about a 7% male visit rate. California invested millions of dollars into male involvement programs. They call them partner involvement programs. They did not move STI rates. They did not move pregnancy rates. But the one thing that I did see is a study that was done by a colleague of mine out in California, which is when they talked to the female partners about their willingness to see male partners, and that was the single most important conduit for men into clinical services. And so that's a tip of an iceberg, which is that young men really fall out of healthcare right after they finish their immunizations and their pediatrician. And so one of the reasons that we have such high rates of STIs on the south side of Chicago is we have just a really dense endemic network, and that network is basically being sustained by young men. So the current public health policy that was passed 2 Januaries ago is that I can give the medication to her to take to him once she has a positive chlamydia test. Usually she's like, I'm not talking to him again, so I'm certainly not going to treat him. So how useful is that? So starting to think about whether technology could be the pathway to starting to get information to young men about the clinic, about services. And then our idea is that we'd have kind of either a website or a series of YouTube videos or an app where you have sort of a male outreach. So she's not going, hey, you have chlamydia or you need to go and get tested. She would say, hey, here's written information. And so what the research shows is that it has to be multiple formats. You have to write, you have to do internet, you have to try and to get to young men or to these populations anyway. So that's sort of that's a thinking if someone buys it. Yeah.
Do you see this app possibly working in other spaces than just like maybe schools or something, maybe like school offices or but is that possible or is that just too difficult?
No, I mean, I think that's exactly right, and that's how people are starting to think about how do you provide healthcare in low-resource settings. So the idea is to try to get kids where they live. A great example of that is right now we do vaccination in the doctor's office, and people are saying, why aren't we doing it in schools? That's where kids are. Same thing with asthma care. Why asthma care always in the hospital? And there was even a study where they showed that in neighborhoods that are unsafe, they don't want to go to the hospital in the middle of the night, so trying to start to do asthma prevention in schools. So we, and James will talk about this as well, we're trying to think about out of school, in school, where can we use tools that can get to young people in remote places. Sometimes contraception and sex, sometimes that's easier out of school, but yeah. I'll turn it over to Jim.
Okay, great. It came up. So Game Changer is kind of the lighter side of the presentation. This is a little bit more on the sort of fun and humanity side.
What's that line about STDs?
So we're a game development lab nested inside of CI3, and CI3, of course, is the Center for Interdisciplinary Innovation and Inquiry in Sexual and Reproductive Health. We, in Game Changer Lab, create games that are health and education related. So I am going to touch on this sort of question of education in schools. So because of our positioning inside of CI3, we touch on issues of sexual and reproductive health in our games and products. Here are just a couple of snapshots. Our process is very important. Here, Melissa, and then this is Patrick Jagoda, who's the other co-founder of Game Changer. He's an assistant professor in the English department here at the University of Chicago. And here we have some of the workshop process down here. you can see we really like to include youth in our game development process from a very early stage, or actually at all stages. We're trying to include youth both in sort of concept phase and then iterative design and play testing and usability. So we work on a kind of a variety of different games. Some are digital and some are analog. This game is a board game that we're just finishing up. It's called Infection 4. And it gives, this is meant for high schoolers. In fact, I think all the games that I'm going to talk about today are meant for high school age youth. So this is a game that allows players to talk about sexually transmitted infections and use their resources in the game to battle these STI monsters. So they have to sort of collaborate and team up and use these resources. You can see a few of them here. There's like a vaccination, there's a condom, there's also support, which is one of the key resources. Oh, okay, yeah. And so there are different situations that kind of arise on the board, and they have to give advice to friends or the characters in the game, and also use these different help resources. And you know, it's a little goofy, but it's actually a lot of fun to play. It really opens up this the topic matter. It puts it on a board game, allows us to put this topic on the table, and so it's just sort of there, available for conversation. Another game that we are just getting into developing is called A Day in the Life, and this is a high school simulation game. And so it's about it's a game that allows players to explore this high school environment, encounter different characters, and then make decisions inside the high school environment. And the decisions that they make in this environment are going to affect other characters in the game. So it's actually a rich little social ecology that we're creating. And there's kind of a ripple effect to decisions that these players make. And we're doing a lot of kind of work with youth and high schoolers to get inspirations for the different characters and the different storylines. And the idea is to make it replayable, so it's kind of a Groundhog's Day type of thing, where they'll go through a day in high school and have a certain series of encounters, and then they can play it again and talk to a different series of characters and make a different series of decisions. So, since this speaker series is all about mobile, I should start talking about mobile pretty soon. So, this is we're just getting going with a little mobile department. I think we've just gotten a little bit of funding to work on a mobile game. And this one is going to fall into the sort of education side. I think Melissa has a lot of very interesting ideas about this. This is health related, but it's not going to seem like it at first. So this is a game that will likely be a part of Chicago Summer of Learning 2014. Has anybody heard of Chicago Summer of Learning? It's like a big citywide initiative to get kids involved in learning activities kind of out of school during the summer. So with this game, I think the working title for it right now is Power Spots. The goal is to get kids to explore these different learning institutions in downtown Chicago. So you see, if they download the app, then they get a map, basically, of these different dots. And each one of these colored dots represents a different learning institution. So there might be Shed Aquarium, or the Art Institute, or the Field Museum, and other smaller museums around. So the goal of the game is, well, let me describe first that they're sort of, they're going to be with mentors. So it's groups of 10 with mentors. And each team has a different color. So there's like the blue team, there's the yellow team, the pink team, the orange team. And they're exploring these different learning opportunities in downtown. And the goal for them is to convert the dots on the map to their color. So the way that they do that is by thoroughly exploring the museum or the space, learning as much as they possibly can, and then doing this sort of quiz or learning challenge thing, which is either on a mobile app or will be presented at like a little kiosk type thing. And so if they successfully pass, as a team, pass that learning challenge, then they take control of that color dot on the map. And so you can imagine this as like a large game of tic-tac-toe or something like that, although it's not exactly a grid. So what they're trying to do is light up these different patterns on the map to unlock rewards from local businesses. Like a team can get cookies from a downtown business. Other examples might be movie passes, day passes to a museum. So the idea is to motivate kids, these high school kids, to learn and become familiar with all these learning opportunities downtown. And it comes from this question of like, what would it mean if education were the responsibility of a distributed network of organizations, not just schools? Okay, so let's see. So there are a couple of sort of murmurs of other mobile projects in development, but they're very new. I mean, we've only sort of had a mobile department for like 2 weeks or something like that. So we're just getting into the game. I made this sort of word cloud or question cloud about, I collect these. There are different questions that tend to come up again and again in our meetings in the game design lab. And a lot of these have to do with how games can affect learning outcomes or get kids to like explore their learning spaces. And we're constantly thinking about what types of games promote what types of learning. So in other words, what's the appropriate should this be a board game or should this be a digital game? What's the population? What do they have access to? What makes sense for this group that we're working with? So, there is a lot of research that goes into this. But again, this is kind of the lighter side of the research that's being done in the biological sciences department and the family planning section. So you can always get a hold of me at this email address or through this phone number. And we have a very open door policy. We really like people from other departments and other fields to come in and talk to us and think about how games could be a powerful tool in their own field, how they can make a difference in their field or games. So anyway, that's it. Pretty short and sweet. I was trying to make sure I wasn't taking up too much time so we'd have some questions at the end. We have time for questions at the end. But any questions for me? Yes?
How long does it take to design a game?
That's a good question. I think it takes us longer than most game companies like in LA or San Francisco because we're really trying to work with youth in the process. So sometimes it can feel like, we're walking through sand or something, but it's really for the best because we're talking to high schoolers and designing a game, a day in the life, so that we really understand what they're going through, what their kind of days look like, what their emotional states look like, what their decisions look like. To answer your question, it depends. I mean, the mobile game that I was talking about is a good idea because it's so simple to develop. So the work there is just in sort of creating those partnerships with the learning organizations and the Hive network. It would take very little time to develop that app. For something like A Day in the Life, which has a lot of AI, artificial intelligence, or non-player characters, it's going to take a lot longer because there's a lot of scripting that has to go into that. So that one's probably going to take a year. Board games, I think that Infection 4, once we really hit our stride with it, we got it to a certain point over like a year, and then we got into a sweet spot, and it took us about 4 months to finish it up, and we could do it really quick. There's a lot of research going into it. Okay.
How do you motivate people to play the game? Besides the monetary rewards are associated with one thing you talked about, how how are you motivating kids to play those games? Is that it's like interest based, or is it just how are you making it available for kids?
That's a really good question. I think that for a couple of the games that we're already developing, like Infection 4, for instance, we are partnering with schools and developing curriculum around it. So it would actually be something that they encounter in school. In that regard, we don't have to worry about like advertising there. But for something like that mobile game, hopefully we can work with the partner organizations to get them to promote it to their audiences so that they can spread the word. And there's also this thing called the Hive Network, which has a pretty nice following. It's like all of these learning institutions in downtown Chicago, and hopefully they can start spreading more about it as well. Yeah.
Similar question, I guess. Really, all of these games really need to be partnered, have a partner to get out there. You can't just put something on iTunes Store.
Well, we can. I think it works better to have promotional partners.
Is there a mechanism to just put it on the iTunes Store and just send it?
Yeah, I mean there are really good sort of blogs that have large followings for educational games, and so the sort of golden ticket is to get featured on the iOS store or on Google Play store, but that can be very difficult. It's a very competitive market, and so getting really positive reviews from blogs or writers who are writing specifically about games for educators is one of the best ways to go.
What are you finding the depth of penetration of kinds of mobile devices that these kinds of games are in your target audiences?
That's a really good question. So what are the numbers of kids that we're working with? These who are in Southside youth. And so how many of them have mobile devices? I don't think that we have the intel on that yet.
Yeah, so for the kids at Planned Parenthood, they think about 50% of them have smartphones. But I agree with Jim that actually knowing how many people have smartphones among youth on the south side of Chicago, that's a harder question. A lot of them have mobile phones, but I think smartphones, I think not as many. There was an early kind of report that said, and it was kind of early MacArthur stuff, sort of saying that youth of color are these large content makers. I think it was a little overblown. I think what we're sort of seeing is that many of them have that they're predominantly texting, and that even with that, a lot of, and this is mainly from research studies when we try to follow people longitudinally. Phone service is on and off again. They're often more disposable phones, so there's certainly limits. I don't know if there's any real kind of study that tells us all.
Right, and so for something like the Power Spots app, that would work because not everybody in a group, they're in a group, and so either we give the mentor an iPad to carry around so they can check in on the status of the game, or one or two people in that group, two of the players in that group might have a phone, so other people can kind of crowd around them if they want to see sort of the state of the game.
Do you have a sense of how long will be before even disposable phones or smartphones?
What's that?
Disposable phone, how long before those are smartphones? 1 year or 5 years, or what's going to happen eventually?
Yeah.
Where even the cheapest phones are smartphones.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, so like burner cell phones.
It's very interesting. So you and I were talking earlier about sort of thinking about the developing world. So Mozilla is now focusing actually on developing a cheap smartphone for the developing world. So they're targeting, I think Brazil, it might be Brazil, India, Hungary, because they think that's where the market is. What I've heard is they're sort of thinking sort of 3 to 5, kind of 3 to 5 year kind of frame for penetration. But I think you're exactly right. Whereas Apple just came out with sort of their cheaper smartphone, but it's still. So, but I think people think with the American market you don't have to have such a cheap phone, and so kind of reaching this population that we're interested in.
No, it's a great question though. I'm sitting in on this business class here, and we've talked about like sort of TAM sum. It's like target, total available market, and then sort of like the total available market that might be interested in something like this. So we need to do some of that business stuff and sort of start, segmenting out our user base, our potential user base. Absolutely.
One of the things that they talk about, and again, kind of taking a public health model, they sort of talk about that even with some of these technological interventions, even if you don't get to everybody, because things like STIs are networked, if you can even get a sizable proportion affected, or even if you get a smaller effect than you might in like a face-to-face visit or something like a more intensive intervention, the potential to reach more people actually kind of gives you this sort of public health effect that begins to kind of change the way that you look at outcomes. So you can kind of think about how even if we're kind of taking a clinic visit and we're turning it into a more superficial interaction, what if you could reach a lot of people? And even if you can't reach all the people, that's an effect on a huge population that we've never been able to do before. So that's, I think, why this work is so compelling. And then if you turn it into games, where as the other question was, something that kids actually want to do, then the potential for moving, theoretically, the potential for moving outcomes is much bigger.
And I mean, a lot of the stuff that we're working on is for youth in Chicago, but there's been a lot of talk from one of our funders about how do we sort of scale this up, how do we make this, for multiple cities or a nationwide thing or global theme. And so, we're starting to try to find games that can expand quickly in the number of users. And so we're looking at some kind of interesting models of games that are able to do that and stay intact even though the number of people is either fluctuating or expanding quickly.
Find gender differences in responses to the game?
That's a really good question.
You mean in response, like when they're playing the game?
Well, I was thinking more in terms of getting people interested in the games.
So I think Jim could talk about in the game, but I was just going to say something that happened before you came was we had workshops where we talked about kind of come in and do narrative and storytelling, and they were predominantly females. And then for the source, where it was sort of game and game designer, it was predominantly males. So we at least think that when we talk about story and narrative, that we often get more. And this is kind of a universal finding. I didn't make it up, but we just observe it as well when we make it seem more tech or STEM or science. We get more males.
Well, and also, part of what we're trying to do is involve youth in the creation process, because if they get interested in becoming game designers, then that can motivate them really well to sort of get into learning these 21st century skills like programming and Photoshop and other tools that don't need to game design. And so, if we're talking about these things as video games, we tend to get more males who are interested. We're showing up to like after school sessions, where we're talking to kids, play tests. So, it gets kind of skewed with that. But let's see. I think that for Infection 4, when we do the playtest, it isn't like young men are more sort of talkative or young women are more talkative. What we find is that a group tends to sort of like have a character. Like sometimes there are very quiet groups of men and women, and other times there will be sort of like somebody who's a leader that sort of emerges in the context of the game and just sort of is kind of prompting other people to take their turn and go around. So we found that like there's sort of like these group characters that tend to emerge. Sorry, that's not terribly clear.
No, that's interesting.
And I think that's one of the reasons we've been so interested in games is that there are so many different learning styles. So for the other day we did an event. It was actually adults, but Jim designed it, and it was something at the Logan Center in conjunction with the Gray Center where people kind of thought they were coming into a cocktail party, and then but it was actually embedded was a series of games. All they knew was that they had a card in their hand, and by the end they actually entered into a collective gameplay experience. But we've written about this and we talk about it a lot, that people have so many different learning styles, and that one of the great things about games is that they activate those different learning styles. But it wasn't until I experienced it myself where literally I could see the person next to me could only see a certain pattern, and I could only see another pattern. But don't you understand that all the ducks are a certain color? And they're like, do you see those little symbols down in that little corner? And it was brought so apparent, and she couldn't even see what I could see. And so I think that's the other thing that we're seeing with young people is that just different aspects of the game are what they're catching on to and continue to follow and continue to excite them. And so having these more complex interventions is really, I think, really helpful. And one of, I thought Jim was going to sort of respond to when he said, why is this about sexual and reproductive health, even though it seems like it's not? And you can say it, or I can talk about it.
Well, you probably know the developmental aspects a lot better than I do. But there are a lot of things that go into positive sexual health decisions, and oftentimes they're things like positive home environments and engagement in school and feelings of hopefulness about the future. Might not initially seem to be about sexual health, but affect quick judgments in certain situations. But please,
yeah. So I think that's just it. It's just getting young kids who are engaged in school and plans for the future, as Jim says, are kids who are much less likely to have risk behaviors. And so we've just realized that education and learning are great ways to think about how we transition into adulthood. And so that's why going to museums and building self-efficacy and working with mentors and starting to see kind of build agency is how we sort of see mitigating risk.
Yeah, and what we're finding, I think, is that these types of games are really effective at arming young learners with one, vocabulary surrounding a certain topic area or situation, and also resources that they have at their disposal. Games are often talked about as resource management systems, and so if we give players, a couple of cards that they can play, that's really powerful, and they know that support is something that they can play in that situation. A vaccination is something that they can play in that situation, and so on. So games are great at just kind of putting these tools in kids' tool belts for a variety of situations. Yeah.
So, for like the two boys, when I think of video games, the word association comes up as addictive. So to flip the question around is there a way to make the really addictive games more educational? And I guess another way of asking it is, do you have the goal of creating addictive games that are educational, that displays the commercial addiction for addictions?
Yeah, games are really good at promoting recurring usage. They put a lot of time and energy into making sure that players are going to not just open the app or the game once, but open it again and again. And a lot of times they'll do that with like internal currencies. And so, if you have racked up a certain amount of coins in the game, then you're more likely to open it up again because now that's you can spend the leftover coins, or a lot of building and management style games will have these little things on timers. So if you're building a little house or a farm or something, then you get revenue from these things. So you have to keep checking back into them to collect your revenue and stuff. So yes, I think that we can harness that addictive quality of games to keep learners involved in these environments for longer. Okay, it looks like it's about 1 o'clock. Are there any other questions?
I know. It was what it was all home done, practices
Thank you.
for
Yeah,
them.
this is
That
nice.
was like,
Oh, man, is this being
Halloween
filmed?
candy
Okay.
and this, but it
Oh, it is.
really, and so it was like
I'm glad I
actually
didn't know
a
that
great
before.
kid. Everybody was like watching, like eating candy on the computer. It's like, I'm in my room. I'm only 11, but I'm in my room.